Shalom. And we just read from Shemot, Exodus 25, 1-16, the Haftorah, I think a little bit longer than 5:26, 6-1. From the Messianic writings, we had 2 Corinthians 8, 1-15. It's the parasha of contributions, or in Hebrew, Terumah. It's the parasha where God introduces us to the concept of donations, to donate for the greater cause. Now we heard how we get the instructions for the building of the Mishkan, but before we can start building, we have to gather the material, and we have to do that from our own pockets. It's a parasha that usually invites its readers to think about all the ins and the outs of the financial life of a person who belongs to God. And it's a topic that doesn't usually excite me very much. But the fact is that in these times in the UK, whether you find discussing finances extremely boring, or as some people, extremely interesting and exciting, it's probably a topic that you have been thinking about quite a lot lately. In these cost of living crisis that we're in, I know that the topic is weighing heavily on the shoulders of a lot of us. It's not something that we can just easily wave away and ignore. So of course, I will get on to talk a little bit about that topic today. But let's not start in the sad and the heavy. Let's start in the Torah. You know what struck me when I read Shemot 25? No, it wasn't so much the fact that we have these really great examples for us of how people willingly just run up to God, happy to give with his cheerful and generous heart. What I was thinking when I read this was actually about the fact that not every donation would have been accepted. Not every boulder and not every plank of wood, as we just heard. God has a very specific list of things that he wants us to give him. He wants us to give him the hardest kinds of wood, the shiniest pieces of metal and gemstones, the most valuable colors. Of course he does, for he is the king. Only the best is good enough for the king, and that makes sense in one way, but in another, doesn't make sense at all. Our king is not an ordinary king. Our king is the one who made all of these things. The little pebble on your driveway at home, and the onyx stone on the breastplate of the high priest. He's the one who made the earth and all that's within it. What does it matter to him what we bring him? You know, if he really wanted a pile of diamonds, he could just make himself a pile of diamonds with a flick of a finger. You could, in one way, say that these things are not really valuable to him at all. We humans call them treasures. That's what we call them. But no other creature on this planet calls them that. Ask the birds in the sky, they don't care. Ask the worms in the ground, they don't care if they would hit their head on a pebble or a diamond. What does it matter to them? Is there even anything intrinsically that says that this pebble is somehow less worth than a diamond? If you dig into it, do a little bit of chemistry, they're just subatomic particles circling each other. There is nothing that says that this is good and that is bad. Or for example, what is the value of the pound coin that you have in your pocket. I could go online and check for you right now what this coin is worth. But I couldn't say what it will be worth tomorrow, and I definitely could not tell you what it will be worth in a year from now. So, one might maybe say that, or ask oneself, if it has a value at all. If you remember last week, Rabbi was talking about man-made moral values. Now, in contrast to God-made, unchanging, absolute moral values. And that's probably something that you have come in contact with before, something that you've been thinking about before. But have you been thinking about the concept of man-made material values? As in, not God-made, not absolute values that are whatever we make them to, a lot or nothing at all. If you live in the UK right now, you've probably been faced with this concept, possibly without thinking about it. Every time you're looking at the receipt after your weekly grocery shopping, or every time you're looking in your bank account after the bills have been paid, you're likely to have the very same paycheck, or maybe even more than you had last year. But then this very same paycheck suddenly doesn't last as long. This means that we all have to reprioritize, ask ourselves, what are the things that are most important in our lives when it comes to these material things? We know that many people have done hard choices, maybe deciding whether they can heat the house to a comfortable temperature or whether they can afford a nice cooked dinner in the evening. Now, some people have been thinking about whether they can afford the petrol just to go and see a loved one. If that might mean that this month they can't put anything away to their pensions or to their holiday funds. You know, we don't all have the same struggles, but we've all felt it in one way or another, having to give up on things that probably we thought that we would never ever have to give up on, things we took for granted. And here in our community, maybe we don't really feel it as hard as everyone else. We're very good, I would say, at picking each other up when the worst thing happens. I think that there's actually quite few people within our congregation who haven't in one way or another been rescued or given better options from someone else in the community. I see so much unselfish, loving acts all the time, and you wouldn't necessarily see them if you're not involved. We don't advertise them, but they're there, and the truth is we are so lucky to have each other. And still, that only takes the edge of the problems off, doesn't it? It's not like we are all walking around with our pockets filled with gold and onyx stones. We couldn't build the Mishkan today, even if we wanted to. Now, I was in a conversation with a friend not long ago, and there was something that she told me that got stuck in my mind. She said that it's as if the Lord is determined to keep his disciples poor. Now, we know that that's not completely true. We're not all poor, but neither are God allowing us to escape this financial situation. Now, the Lord could make gold just pour out of our pockets. He could duplicate, triplicate our salaries if he so wanted to. It wouldn't be hard for him. It wouldn't even be the first time he's done something like that. But letting us escape this situation is clearly not on his agenda. Annoyingly, possibly, we might think. But isn't this also what we see in history as we go back through our scriptures? Surely some of our greats of old, they have had a lot of wealth, especially in the end of their life. Abraham, for an example, Joseph, we know, some of the kings definitely, but I would say that that's rather an exception from the rule than the rule itself. Think about Moshe. Now, Moshe grew up in this wonderful palace, right? But then when he accepted his identity as a Jew, he had to escape and he had to move into something like a farm. And then when he really took on the burden of his calling in the Lord, where did he end up? In a tent. I'm imagining that also the life of a lot of the people that God called to be his prophets were far from comfortable. God calling them to go from place to place, being at the mercy of whoever he sent them to. And sometimes he sent them to kings, but sometimes he didn't. I'm thinking of Elijah and how God sent him out to the wilderness, to a place so desolate that God himself had to send a raven with bread to him so that he wouldn't just pass out. And he was there for a while, and after that, God sent him to live in the house of a poor widow. That wasn't a luxury accommodation in any sense of the word. I'm thinking of the 100 unnamed prophets that lived at the time of Elijah, that had to escape the evil anger of Jezebel and go and live for quite a while in caves. And that was the Lord's called prophets. I'm thinking of Jeremiah, our prophet of Lamentations, and how God actually commanded him to go and do a really bad business deal, to go and buy a field that he knew would soon become desolate, would soon be taken over by the Babylonians. And he, Jeremiah, he wouldn't even be there to see it. He would be in exile in Egypt. Now, Yeshua, of course, very clearly called his closest Talmidim to live a similar lifestyle, just as these prophets, asking them to give up everything, to follow him, wandering from place to place with little more than what they needed to survive the day, sometimes even less. Sometimes God had to intervene. And as we know, the Son of Man has nowhere to rest his head. I think perhaps the most detailed account that we have of the life that Yeshua called some of his disciples to is in the life of Shaul. Going from prison cells to sinking ships, being hungry, thirsty, cold, never safe from physical harm. And Shaul isn't ashamed of sharing these things with us. We have many records of him describing it. We have, for an example, in one place he writes that we try to commend ourselves in every way as workers for God by continually enduring troubles, hardships, calamities, beatings, imprisonments, riots, overwork, lack of sleep and food, as punished yet not killed, as having reason to be sad, yet always filled with joy, as poor, yet making many people rich, as having nothing, yet having everything. He says this and many, many things like it, but it's the way that he says it that makes it so remarkable. What he says sounds paradoxical to us, contradictory. It's a list of problems, but it's also a list of reactions to these problems that are not the normal reactions that you would expect. Reason to be sad, yet joyful, being poor, yet making people rich. And in one way, of course, we understand where he comes from. We're not strangers to God's ways. Of course, he's just echoing the teachings of so many people before him about how these worldly treasures means nothing when it comes to the really important things in life, the ultimate, the eternal goals. We have prophets, we have Psalms, we have Proverbs, everyone talking about it. Just one example from Psalms 49. It says, "Why should I fear when evil day comes? When wicked deceivers surround me, those who trust in their wealth and boast in their great riches. No one can redeem the life of another or give God a ransom for them. The ransom for life is costly. No payment is ever enough." Monetary payment. Or as Yeshua says, "Store up your treasures in heaven." That's where the greatest reward is. That's where the greatest pension fund is. It's eternal. It cannot be destroyed. But yet, despite all these things, all these facts that we know, it would be stupid to deny that the world is not run by money. And that we all have bills to pay. We all have families to feed. So the question is, how do you both care about money and at the same time don't care at all? Shaul was a human. He cared. He had a body with aches and issues. He complains a lot. It says in one place that he's even despairing of life itself. He cares. But at the same time, he doesn't. How do you live in a world where money is such a crucial building block and at the same time doesn't really matter? Now, when I was thinking about this, praying, pondering on it, I stumbled upon a passage from 2 Corinthians chapter 5. It's a very short statement by Shaul, but it's very powerful. He says that if we are insane, it is for God's sake. And if we are sane, it is for your sake. And at first this might sound just as contradictory as all the other things that he just said. But the key is that he's not saying that some people are insane because God wants it that way, and some people are sane. He says that sometimes his actions may seem sane, and sometimes his actions might seem insane, depending on what he is trying to achieve. And I get this. As someone who is really trying to seem sane right now, make sense to you, trying to explain a complicated theological concept in a way that works, that makes sense, that connects with you. It should be the same goal every time we speak to someone about the Lord, whether within our family or outside of the family. We want to use words that they understand and connect with. We want to seem sane. We have a very good example of this principle in the Messianic writings when we're talking about speaking in tongues. And it says that when we meet together like this, we can't all speak in tongues at the same time. Because one, no one will hear each other, no one will understand each other. But two, and most importantly, if someone walks in on us who's new to the faith, they are going to think that we are out of our minds. And then probably will get frightened away. And that's really counterproductive. They're not understanding all the wonderful things that we are doing. But one doesn't always want to be behaving sanely either. Someone told me not long ago, in a very loving and warm way, that AY is filled with people that aren't completely sane. And I'd like to reformulate that. AY is filled with people that walk with God. And when a person does that, makes decisions based on feelings in the spirit, acts in an outburst of worship or religious fervor, trust in something that he or she cannot see, then it may look a little bit insane to the observer from the outside. We're insane for God's sake, as Shaul puts it. No tithing during a cost of living crisis. That is insane. Me and my husband would be very happy with an extra couple of £100 in our pockets, yet we much prefer giving it away. And I know that you guys here understand why we do it, because you're doing the same, but one cannot expect someone who doesn't know the Lord to understand it. That person might very well think that we all really need to go and see a shrink throwing away money in a monetary crisis. But any useful servant of God needs to know how to move between the sane and the insane, the spiritual and the worldly. As Shaul says, I will pray with my spirit, but I will also pray with my understanding. I will sing with my spirit, but I will also sing with my understanding. And believe it or not, we can actually apply this principle to our cost of living dilemma. Bear with me. Now, we've already played with the idea that to God, money has very little value. So that for the sake of how we communicate with him, how we worship with him, of course, money is not that important. Does he care whether our tithes, our 10%, ends up being £10 or £1,000? Of course he doesn't care. He's the guy who invented the idea of giving in percentages, and he's not disappointed with it. He's happy with his decisions. But just like Shaul teaches on the sane and the insane, there is a reason to care about money. And it's not because of God. It's for the sake of others. For an example, it's good that we all have nice clothes to wear. But it's not for the sake of God that we wear them. God made man naked. And he said that it was good. But if we would all come in to the synagogue on Shabbat morning naked, or say in dirty clothes, smelly clothes with holes in them, then I guarantee you that very few people would want to listen to what we teach. They'd just be distracted or frightened, definitely not wanting to come and join us and be like us. Or similarly, it's a good thing that we bought this building, right? It's a good thing that we did the extension. But it's not because God prefers to listen to our worship when we're performing it nicely for him on a nice stage. Now, God didn't make a synagogue for Adam and Chava. He was perfectly happy to listen to their prayers and their praise from any hilltop or any cave that they happened to be in. We humans made up the synagogue. We invented it much later, when we felt like we needed a place to gather together, a safe place with the outside world outside for us to be in here together, to nourish each other, to teach each other, to encourage each other in worship. Now, a place that has microphones and books and a whiteboard. And that's all good. It's good when we have more than what we need to survive, because we can use it for the good of others. Now that leads us back to the building of the Mishkan again, when we were told to build it with all these fine things, the sheepskin and the onyx and the purple dye. Consider that many of these things, possibly all of these things, we had just been given when we left Egypt. God made the Egyptians to give us all this wealth. We were poor. We were slaves. And possibly for the first time in our lives, we had these riches. And then, almost straightway, God asks us to give them up again. It's like God gave us those riches just so that we could give it away. And not to him even, per se, for building something for the good of Israel, for the good of the world. The Haftarah portion that we read today speaks about King Shlomo and the wealth and the wisdom that God gave him. And the passage talks about what he did with his wealth and this wisdom. It says that he used it to create this peaceful economic alliances with the nations around us. It says that throughout the reign of Shlomo, there was peace all around the borders of Israel. It says that everyone in Israel and Yehuda lived in peace, and that is something really rare and something really precious for us as Jews. It also talks about how Shlomo put Israel on the map. He did some outreach, if you might say. There were people coming in to us from all the other nations. It says that rulers of other nations were praising the name of Adonai. It's as if God knew when he gave Shlomo this wealth that he would use it to bless God's people. And of course he did. But we can't just read this story without thinking about all the warnings in the end of it. We can't ignore it. All the warnings in the scripture about what abundance can do to you, how hard it is, just like for King Shlomo, to keep your heart humble, submitted to God, relying on God when you have that much. Thankfully, we are not in that situation, are we? Thankfully, God has given us a cost of living crisis. Thankfully, we don't have the same temptations as Shlomo or, say, his father, David. For the love of money is the root of all kinds of evil, right? It's easier for a camel to pass through a needle's eye than it is for a rich man to enter the kingdom of God. You cannot serve both God and money. Blessed are the poor. Our struggles today are becoming less and less like those of Shlomo and David, and more of those like Shaul was facing. So our task needs to be to make Shaul's perspective ours, having nothing, yet everything, rejoicing all on the surface. It seems like we have so many reasons to be sad. You know, we shouldn't ignore that God knows that there are certain things that we need. He knows we have mortal bodies. We need a little bit of, at least some food, at least some water, a little bit of shelter. There are things that we need, and Yeshua teaches us to pray for those things, for our daily bread, just what we need to get through the day. And he says that God does care, that we shouldn't even worry about these things, but that he will provide these things, the daily bread that we need. But for all other things, the extras, the diamonds and the onyx stones, there really is no guarantee that he will provide it for us. God might choose a path where we have plenty and plenty to give, but he might as well choose a path where we have to give up almost all of the comforts that we so enjoy. No path is better than the other. No path is holier than the other. But it takes faith to think in this way. Faith that God knows the best for us more deeply than what we know it ourselves, because we always think that the best for us is to have all these things, the nice economic safety net. That's what we think it means to be blessed. It may not be what God means when he says that he's going to bless you. So we have to ask ourselves, especially in these times, if we as individuals have the faith to trust that whatever path God leads our lives on, surrounded by a lot or a little, that he is actually leading us on the right way forward. We have to ask ourselves if we dare to follow wherever, and I mean literally wherever, he may lead us. Amen.